Thank you. Although I know that you're clapping for the true star of this presentation, which is Ruffian, who's hiding behind the podium. Ruffian is a 12-year-old sled dog. She's been a veteran of both the Iditarod and the Yukon Quest. She's seen a lot of trail miles, and I'm sure could tell many, probably even better stories than us up here. But the Yukon Quest is a 1,000-mile sled dog race, and when you think of 1,000 miles, that's like us running from New York to Florida in 10 to 14 days. And these athletes do it year after year, and not just do it, but thrive doing it. It's really amazing. Ruffian here is an Alaskan Husky, as are many of the sled dogs, and that's probably what Denali and Margie are going to talk a little bit about. There's no AKC registration for an Alaskan Husky. They're basically a mutt, a breed of northern mutts. And they're not bred for how they look, but they're bred for how their skills, for how their demeanor, and also for their heart. And these dogs have a lot of heart. And you're going to hear a lot about how they're bred and what they're bred for a little bit later. But we're really proud to be bringing this to you all. These dogs are an amazing, amazing, not only athlete, but also pets and friends. And they're great to have on any team that you have. So I'm excited that we can bring this to you guys right now. So you guys are very lucky. We have two amazing veterinarians that not only practice here in North Pole, but also have been on some of these trails, working with these sled dogs day in, day out, getting very little sleep as they make sure that these dogs are really well taken care of. And that's really one of the core elements of the Yukon Quest or any sled dog race is canine care. This is all about the dogs, and we really make sure that they get the best of care. These veterinarians vie for positions on the trail, and we have veterinarians from all over the world that spend their time making sure these dogs get nothing but the best attention. So for our two veterinarians that you'll be hearing from tonight, the first we have Dr. Margaret Eastman. She received her degree in veterinary medicine in 1993 and began working on sled dog races really shortly after that. She came up here and worked not only on the Iditarod, but was also the head veterinarian for the Yukon Quest from 2001 to 2003. And we've convinced her to hop back on the trail this year. So she'll be spending a lot of sleepless nights and maybe a little bit of cold feet as we care for the sled dogs. We also have Denali Lovely, and she received her Doctor of Veterinary Medicine in 2001 from Washington State University. She was raised right here in Fairbanks and has spent a lot of her life around sled dogs and ski joring dogs. And she's worked in several sled dog races as well. In fact, this year she's going to be on the Junior Yukon Quest, which is a race for youth age 14 through 17, as our head veterinarian on that race. So we're really excited and proud to have these two veterinarians on the Yukon Quest team, and I'm very proud to introduce them to you. Enjoy their lecture. Thank you.
Thank you for such a warm welcome. We'd like to thank UA and UAF and the Geophysical Institute for having us, and we'd also like to thank Julie and the Yukon Quest for putting us in contact with Amy so that we could bring you this information, this very timely information as we get into the season. As Julie mentioned, I'm going back on the trail again this year for the first time in 3 years, and it's because my husband and I had a baby. So I think I'm going to get more sleep on the trail than my husband is at home with Jack. So I'm really looking forward to it for so many reasons. So let's begin. Sled Dog Science. And sled dogs have certainly come a long way, and a lot of what we know now is knowledge we accumulated not only through oral tradition and the anecdotes of those who started this sport, moving it from freighting animals and functional to the racing aspect, but also a very dedicated group of veterinarians who started the ISDVMA, the longest acronym ever, the International Sled Dog Veterinary Medical Association. In 1994, this group of 10 were trail veterinarians on the Iditarod, and part of the reason they formed was to sort of standardized care for sled dogs along the trail. All of us come from a pet dog background, and as those of you who have sled dogs or who work closely with them will tell us, they're not pets. They're different. They have different needs, and they also have different gifts and talents, and that's why they can do what they do. So the group formed to learn more about sled dogs and standardize their care so that we would actually be helpful on the trail and not a hinder, but also forge some collaboration with drivers and academic institutions such as veterinary schools and also the race organizations themselves to produce some scientific studies that have made their way into the mainstream of veterinary literature. So what is a sled dog? And Julie alluded to this with her lovely special guest, Ruffian. You can see this is the first group, of course, and these are very typical of old pictures of Alaska. After I put this in here, I thought, what a great picture. I thought, where's the snow? I am sure that in the winter, these dogs have another gig. The sled dogs were bigger, heavier, very functional, not particularly fast, but held together well. Quite a hodgepodge, as we said. They weren't bred for pretty. But this group, I think, held a special duty. As you can see, that's the Eldorado Bottling Company, and they weren't bottling milk and juice. So little libations with minors. So in creating the sled dog that we see today, their distant roots, of course, are in the big freight dogs, the very functional northern breeds, those dogs with the big pointy ears and the double coat. The usual suspects, we have the Canadian Inuit dog, and you can see they're in a fan hitch. In places where there are no trees, there's no need to string them out in a straight line. And so there are a couple races where fan hitches are used, but that's more of a traditional hitch. We're used to seeing the, let's see, will move, great. The Malamutes are in the more typical, toe line conformation. I took this picture out of the, a website, partly because I thought, wow, that's a lot of stubborn, those Malamutes. But also, I counted, I think there's 22 Malamutes on this dinky little road with this tiny sled, and I thought, this dude has a death wish. It just looked like fun. So, and of course, the Siberian Husky, which is probably, if you had to pick a pure breed that's most prevalent in our sled dogs, it would be the Siberian Husky. And this beautiful female belongs to Karen Ramstead, and not only is she a sled dog and an Iditarod dog, she's also a champion. So there's one breed that really can do what they say they can do, at least in her hands. And of course, the Samoyed. Now, I put this in here just because I grew up with Samoyeds, but I don't know anybody that would actually admit that they have Samoyeds in their sled dogs. They're big, fuzzy, and fun, and they're good for sprints, but we don't see a whole lot on the trail, as you can imagine. Siberian teams, now we do. There are still some very respectable, purebred Siberian teams on the trail, but I think those that work with them would agree that when we say they're Slowberians, we mean it, and they give you 80%, 100% of the time, but they're wonderful dogs, hold up nicely, have beautiful feet. So there they have it. So someone felt the need for speed and started adding in the genetics from other breeds, and that's a great way to go. And it deepens the gene pool. So here we have, of course, the Greyhound, which of course is not double-coated. But if you look at sprint dogs, and a lot of sled dogs, this starts to look familiar. They're well-muscled, lean, deep-chested dog. They're not as barrel-chested as some of their predecessors. And of course, I heard a rumor that Salukis too, and I thought, what? And then I saw this picture and thought, oh yeah, I see that. That would be smart. So in addition to the need for speed, we also know that those northern breeds are a bit on the stubborn side, and so some mental malleability, a little trainability would be a nice addition. So we see more influences from the sporting breeds. I've heard rumors of setters. I haven't known a lot of really brilliant Irish setters, so that's just a rumor. So I'm sorry to the Irish setter people, but you know. And then of course the retriever. This is my dog. Ooh, yeah. I also have a Siberian Husky at home, so we have the malleable and the stubborn as well. And then of course, probably the introduction of the breed that has been most prevalent, and that you may have actually noticed, is the pointer. This puppy is an Eggle Ellis dog, and this is a sprint dog. It looks like it should be upland hunting, so does this guy, but he's pretty agile. The pointers, there are a lot of upland hunting endurance events in the lower 48, and some of those dogs actually found their way into our genetics. Initially in the sprint dogs, but as our winters have gotten warmer, a lot of drivers have found that, there's nothing wrong with adding a little oomph to your team. However, the hair coat can be an issue, especially on Yukon Quest. It does get cold, and they're out there for quite a while. So both races, Iditarod and Quest, have instituted rules that require a double coat. So you can run your pointer, but they have to have enough husky in to stay warm. But they are a little higher maintenance dogs, but they can be quite fast. So this leaves us with our Ferrari from the initial pickup truck, the Alaskan Husky. And these dogs are bred and selected for speed and endurance, which means we don't see a lot of the conformation problems we see in a lot of the purebred dogs. We don't see hip dysplasia. We don't see anterior cruciate ligament tears, that sort of thing. However, because they have a common lineage, we are starting to see that there are some heritable defects that are popping up. Epilepsy, of course, epilepsy isn't that uncommon in the general population, but some of the things we think we can skate away from because they're mutts, you can't if we're still working with the same gene pool, and so that's the challenge we deal with now. But they all have a common function as canine athletes, whether they're more pointer, more husky, bigger, littler, buff, or not. So, and then what do we ask them to do? Now, I worked on the Iditarod, but I have a huge bias for the Yukon Quest. So, here we have it. This is the map of the Quest Trail, and this year we're starting in Whitehorse. It's much harder because we're going uphill this year. Not really. So we're starting in Whitehorse and working our way toward Fairbanks. The white boxes are checkpoints, and at each checkpoint, the mushers have shipped ahead their supplies. The trucks and the handlers go as well, but the trucks and handlers have to keep hands off. They're pretty much there to collect dogs that are dropped along the way that the veterinarians are working with. So even though there's road access to most of these places, the handlers are pretty much, can't tell them they're an accessory, but they're very necessary, but they don't get to do a whole lot until Dawson. Then they're of utmost importance. So then the black little dots are dog drops. Ooh, there's my arrow. There we go. So the dog drops are places along the trail, and Slavens is remote, and there's another one, Stewart River is quite remote, where there are veterinarians, and if a driver needs to drop a dog, they certainly can, because you can notice that this is the Pelly, Eagle, Dawson. That's a long haul. If a driver needs to drop a dog there, then we put him on a plane and fly him out. Okay, moving on. There we go. So in a nutshell, the race is, as Julie said, about 1,000 miles, and they tend to complete it in 10 to 14 days, and I think the Quest has a, was it pick the time, or there's a contest you can play if you want to guess what the elapsed time will be. I'm guessing 11 hours and a half, so there you go. And then they do get 42 hours of mandatory rest. 36 hours of those are in Dawson, the halfway point, and 2 are at the first checkpoint, wherever that happens to be, either end, and then 8 are at the last checkpoint. And all 3 of those include mandatory veterinary exams for every dog. Generally, the veterinarians see every dog at every checkpoint, but those are the 3 that we sit down and go through with a fine-tooth comb. Let's see. The dogs teams all start with 8 to 14 dogs, and typically everybody starts with 14, and you have to finish with a minimum 6. They're at 8 checkpoints with full support, and they're drop bags, and then 4 dog drops with shelter and veterinarians only. And this is different from the Iditarod. You'll notice if you look at an Iditarod trail map, there are checkpoints everywhere. And so that's one of the challenges of the Quest, is that the drivers and their dogs still have to do some of that freighting capacity. They still have to carry their stuff. The checkpoints are, most of them are 70 to 150 miles apart, but the longest leg is 201 miles. So you have to pack for what in another place would be a race. And these are the elevations. And, you know, in Eagle Summit gets all the pub, but Rosebud's kind of high, American Summit, and King Solomon's Dome. So they have 4 good climbs. And, of course, coming this way, the Circle City to Eagle Summit, that's a long haul. And so Dr. Lovely's going to talk about how they use that much energy to produce that much mechanical work. And the dogs run fairly even run-rest cycles. Usually 6 hours on, 6 hours off is kind of the conventional wisdom, although as you get toward the end of the race, that's when the strategy comes in, and you can maybe eke away with a little rest, or a little less rest, or stockpile it. That's musher stuff. They can cover 100 miles per day, and depending on the weather, terrain, and the race length, and also where you're at on Eagle Summit. And the dogs run from about 8 to 14 miles per hour, again, depending on the terrain for the most part. This is Dawson City. This is the halfway point. And so the campground where the dogs are, I believe, it's across the river. We're over here. And at Dawson, the dogs can be handled by the handlers. And they have open-ended shelters, and it's a great chance to recuperate. And then the mushers can recuperate over here in town in their hot tub or whatever they find. The dogs who are resting for the 36 hours pretty much eat, sleep, and, well, eliminate. And it does a world of good. It's a great time if there are little things that need to heal. But Dawson is a lovely place. If you've never been there, I would say go. And this, of course, is the fabled Eagle Summit. And these are 2 teams going up. And actually, I have to confess, I looked at this, I'm like, wow, look at this team's going down. They're really going fast. And Dr. Lovely said, they're going up. I'm like, oh, sorry. So as you can see, Nobody's all balled up. They're going up this steep incline. But you can see that, the wind whips through here. That can be a real problem with visibility. But one of the great developments on the trail this year on the Quest is Julie worked very hard and got a BLM grant, and there are permanent markers over Eagle Summit now. So, yay. So they can plant their flags. So how do they do this? The research that has been done is focused on Alaskan Huskies versus pointers or Siberians. It's been principally the mixed breed, simply because a lot of the studies have been done with dogs that are toward the front of the pack of the Iditarod, and that's who tends to be the fastest. They've been conducted in both distance and sprint dogs. Some of the nutrition things have been done on sprint dogs just because that's Arlie Reynolds' thing. And in training, at rest, and then usually before and after races. We don't do much with them research-wise during races. They're busy. And most of the information is pertinent to dogs running marathon races, such as Yukon Quest and Iditarod. However, sprint dogs can benefit as well. They have the multiple day event, but it's usually not more than 3, so therein lies a difference. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Lovely. She's going to talk about the normal physiology of sled dogs and how they can achieve these feats that we can only dream of. So I'll turn it over to her.
So when Margie first asked me if I wanted to do this lecture with her, I didn't ask a lot of questions. So I thought it was going to be for a small group of people, and little did I know. But thank you all for coming. So sled dogs that are competing in these long distance races must maintain a high level of work output for long periods of time. They're often running 10 to 14 hours a day for 10 to 14 days straight. So that's a lot of energy they're using up. They've often had, 1,500 to 3,000 miles of training before the race even starts. So they've put a lot of miles under them. The reasons that they can do this are due to a couple of different reasons. One, selective breeding. So as you know, just because it's a husky doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to pull. Just like if you're a retriever, you're not necessarily going to always retrieve. So I have to give the example, since my dad is here, that he had a retriever when the first time he took her out duck hunting. She went to retrieve the duck and swam around it and came back without the duck. So then he had to go out and retrieve the duck, and when he came back, she was laying on the wet dog was laying on his clothes. So case in point, retrievers aren't always retrievers. So, so selective breeding, good training. These mushers and dogs are spending a lot of long hours training, proper nutrition, and then there's physiologic changes that the body makes to adapt to these intense levels of training. Heavily trained long-distance sled dogs have a lot of physiologic similarities to human marathoners or heavily trained cross-country skiers, so a lot of research has been done with humans. So how does your body respond to these increased exercise demands? The basics are the more your muscles work, the more oxygen they need. So your body compensates for this by, one, increasing your heart rate. Everyone knows if you go play basketball or run, your heart rate goes up. And two, by increasing the stroke volume. What that means is how much blood is pumped out of your heart at each beat. The body does this by increasing the contractions of the heart and increasing the pressures with which blood is returned to the heart. This is a cat heart, which is basically similar to any mammal heart. And blood from your body comes into the right side of the heart, so it goes into the right atria, where it's contracted and the blood goes down to the right ventricle. That blood is pushed out to the lungs, where the blood is oxygenated. And then from the lungs, the blood goes back into the left atria and the left ventricle, and the left ventricle pushes the blood out to the rest of the body. So in a normal dog, if you notice the wall of the right ventricle, it's a lot thinner than the wall of the left ventricle. That's because the right ventricle doesn't have to push blood as far. It's just going to the lungs. The left ventricle has to push that blood all the way out to the rest of the body. So that's a normal response to have a thicker wall. In sled dogs, this left side of the heart is even thicker. It gets thicker than a normal dog. And the reason for that is the heart is a muscle. It's like any other muscle in their body. The more you work it, the bigger it's going to get. increased muscle mass is due to the increased heart rate and the stroke volume. So, and the big word for an increased muscle is hypertrophies. So if you really want to use a big word, you can say, well, I just went to the gym, my biceps hypertrophied. So same with the heart. It's a normal physiologic response to endurance training. This happens in human marathoners, cross-country skiers that are intensely training. And interesting, it's reversible. So the research has shown that after 4 to 8 weeks of sitting on your couch watching TV, that change in that muscle mass is going to reverse back to more a normal thickness of your heart. Alaska Sled Dog's heart size is bigger than a sedentary dog. Alaska Sled Dog heart is about 1% of their body weight, where a Basset Hound, and no offense to Basset Hound owners, but they like to lounge around, their heart is only about 0.8% of their body weight. So in people, there's a syndrome called athletic heart syndrome that's been well documented and well researched. And so the veterinarians out on the trail started wondering, are there the similar changes to these sled dogs? So they started doing more research on these dogs. So first thing they did was started auscultating more, which means that they were listening to their heart. And they did find that these heavily trained sled dogs often had grade 1 to 2 heart murmurs. This was due to the increased stroke volume and heart enlargement. And it's prevalent in 30 to 50% of human and canine endurance athletes. They also tried to correlate these changes with finishing status in race, and they found that these dogs that did have heart murmurs often outperformed the dogs that didn't have heart murmurs. So what that showed them was this is a normal physiologic change. This is not due to cardiac disease. And most of the time, if it was due to cardiac disease, these dogs wouldn't have made it to that point in the first place. The other thing they started doing were electrocardiograms. Electrocardiograms measure the electrical activity of the heart. Because of the heart enlargement in that left ventricle that we talked about, there were changes on the ECG. These changes could be interpreted as abnormal. They also tried to correlate these changes with the race, and they found that the ECG findings that supported an increased heart size, that those dogs were more likely to finish the race than dogs that had a normal ECG. However, those changes did not correlate with placing. So if these dogs showed an abnormal ECG because their heart was enlarged, they weren't placing any higher, but they were more likely to finish a race than a sled dog that did not have those changes. So this is an ECG right here in a normal dog. So this is electrical activity of the heart. This is the P wave, so that is the electrical activity that makes the atria contract in the heart. And then this is the QRS wave, which is the electrical activity that makes the ventricles contract. So this R wave in sled dogs is often a lot taller because the contractions are harder, and it's often of longer duration. So it would look different than a normal dog. So what's the significance of all this? The significance is in a normal sedentary dog or even a sled dog that has minimal mileage on them, a presence of a heart murmur or an abnormal ECG would be concern for structural heart disease or some type of pathology going on in the heart. In these sled dogs, these findings can be a completely normal physiologic response to endurance training. And so the veterinarian's challenge is to make sure they know what level of activity and training these dogs have had before when you're interpreting these abnormalities. And again, the same thing happens with humans. The other area of research has been in nutrition. Dr. Kenneth Henchcliffe and Dr. Arlie Reynolds have done a lot of research in this category. What it all comes down to is exercise increases your metabolic rate. So you have to be able to provide adequate substrates such as glucose, fats, and proteins to working muscles. And you have to be able to remove waste products, so carbon dioxide and heat, and then convert that energy to mechanical work. All in a day's work. I mean, we all do this all the time. Sled dogs just do that at an increased rate. So even though sled dogs mainly utilize fat for their metabolism and their energy needs, glycogen, which is the storehouse for carbohydrates, is still plays a vital role for these dogs. Intramuscular glycogen is important for supplementing energy provided by fat metabolism for high energy demand. So you use the intramuscular glycogen when you're going up hills and you're sprinting. So it really does play an important role. Intramuscular glycogen stores can be depleted in 1 day of exercise. If stores are depleted, there's an increased reliance on fat and blood sugar or glucose for energy. Arlie Reynolds has done a lot of studies on supplementing dogs 30 minutes after they get done with a race or with their training run with oral glucose polymer solutions. If you do that, that has been shown to improve the rate at which muscle glycogen stores are restored, and it helps them bounce back better. Human studies show that glycogen depletion causes an increase in onset of fatigue for athletes. So that's why these long-distance runners are drinking Gatorade and Powerade, is they're trying to reserve their muscle glycogen stores so that they have a better performance. So I didn't mean to advertise for McDonald's, but we just compared these energy needs to what people would eat. These sled dogs have huge caloric requirements. They're also mainly depend on fat and protein for their energy needs. They need up to 10,000 kilocalories per day, which that comes down to 18 Big Macs per day. So if you can imagine running 100 miles a day and eating 18 Big Macs, I don't know if hardly any of us could do that. I don't know if any of us could. So dogs tend to fat load during races versus humans, who we tend to carbohydrate load. And that all comes through evolution. Dogs, historically, that's what they ate, were high protein, high fat foods. They were carnivores. So sled dogs have a unique ability to rapidly digest a high-fat meal and provide the energy contained in the meal to skeletal muscle in a readily available form. It's what makes them such successful athletes. Another thing about sled dogs is a lot of these dogs are selected in races for actually making sure that they eat during races. Some dogs, when they get stressed or over exercise, they don't want to eat. So they have to, since their calorie output is so high, the mushers really have to make sure they have dogs that are going to eat through the races. So the other big thing is water intake and losses. Sled dogs, racing sled dogs, need 5 liters a day of water. They mainly lose water through their respiratory tract and their urine. They don't sweat like you or I, so the respiratory tract is usually where they lose most of their water. Sled dogs can lose too much sodium in urine due to large caloric intake, so they're eating a lot, drinking a lot, which makes them urinate a lot, and they can lose too much sodium. Loss of sodium can cause fatigue, and in fact, a greater proportion of dogs drop had abnormally low blood sodium concentrations. So the mushers have to be really concerned about dehydration with these guys, especially if they start getting any type of gastrointestinal signs, diarrhea, or not eating as well. Dehydration can cause fatigue, inappetence, diarrhea, weight loss. One of the things the veterinarians do at the checkpoints is after a dog has been well rested, they'll go out and listen to their heart. If their heart rate is less than 100, usually in a well-rested dog, that's normal. The dog's not under any stress. If their heart rate is greater than 140 beats per minute, then that can often tell them, yes, they're dehydrated, they're stressed, something else is going on here. And then the last thing is oxidant damage. We've all heard of free radicals and antioxidants. That's why we drink blueberry juice and grapeseed oil and whatever is out there. So these free radicals are due to oxygen metabolism. So these sled dogs, especially, they're metabolizing more and quicker, so they have lots of free radicals that are being produced. Free radicals are absorbed by antioxidants. And exercise was associated with a significant decline in serum vitamin E concentrations. So they measured the serum vitamin E and found that dogs with higher serum vitamin E concentrations are twice as likely to finish the race. So the recommendation now is to supplement your dogs with vitamin E daily with a high-fat meal, and to be aware that if you have other fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A and D, those can be toxic at high levels, so only use the vitamin E. In the Iditarod, they are also doing pre-race blood work. So they're looking at the complete blood count, which looks at red blood cells and white blood cells, and a chemistry panel, which looks at liver, kidneys, electrolytes, and trying to correlate some of those values with actually finishing the race and status. So there's a lot of correlations that have been going on that they've found, but you know, I don't think they've made any firm results with it. So anyway, back to Margie, and she's going to talk about a few studies that have been done in the recent years with these sled dogs.
Okay, on to the truly heady stuff. This picture is taken by a good friend of mine, Brent Starks, who's going to be the head vet of the Quest this year. And this is just outside Eagle, Alaska. A lovely place if you haven't been there. So we're going to talk about three, isn't that pretty? 3 areas of research that have taken up a lot of the sled dog resources and been studied quite widely in the last few years. The first is hypothyroidism. And hypothyroidism is a disease that we see in our pet dogs, we see in our sled dogs, we see in our friends, because people get it too. The thyroid gland controls metabolism, in a nutshell. It's a little more complex than that, but that's all I understand. So it controls metabolism, and if you're hypothyroid, then of course your thyroid gland is underactive. So as with any endocrine disease in dogs, and I assume in people too, there's kind of the buffet of clinical signs. You don't necessarily see all of them. You can see them in varying amounts and to varying degrees. So, but they all stand to reason. We see decreased activity, and in a sled dog, this can mean just poorer performance than has historically been the case. Unexplained weight gain, and usually with a normal or decreased appetite. It's not that they're hungry and eating more, it's an unexplained weight gain. It's just that every calorie goes to their hips. So. Also, we see skin conditions, dull hair coat, persistent skin infections, and those are the rashes that come, your veterinarian treats them, they go away, they come back, your veterinarian treats them, that kind of thing. And also hair loss, and it can be a little patchy hair loss, or it can be pretty substantial. And also some dogs experience cold intolerance. This little dog, I don't know if she's hypothyroid. I took her off the Animal Planet website because she was in the world's ugliest dog contest. But I thought, if anybody looks hypothyroid, that's the one. So the reason this is important is because we did tend to see a lot of sled dogs that seem to be hypothyroid. We draw their blood and say, well, your values are a little low, let's put you on Siloxane. And we're finding that maybe that wasn't always the case. So Dr. Justine Lee, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine, and she's a diplomat, which means she's really smart. She's a diplomat at the American College of Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care. So she did a study, starting with the 1996 Iditarod, where she measured plasma thyroid hormones before, immediately after, and 3 months after the race in 122 dogs. So all 3 of those samples from the same 122 dogs. Before the race and 3 months afterward, which on the Iditarod would put them in March, which essentially would be vacation time, 25% of the dogs had thyroid values below the reference range. And when we say the reference range, we mean the normals that we accept, and those were put together by University of Michigan because they have a great endocrinology lab, and we all sent our stuff there, and so they came up with numbers for us. So a quarter of the dogs were pretty normal, but their numbers fell low, their thyroid fell low. Immediately after the race, 92% had T4 values below the reference range, and T4 is it's the active form of thyroid hormone. It's just one of the forms that we measure. All of these dogs tested were clinically and biochemically normal. I mean, how much healthier could you be? You just finished the Iditarod. And so the conclusion is that this decrease in plasma thyroid hormone is probably a normal physiological response to exercise. So you don't have to medicate it, at least at that point. However, the other result of this, which on a practical level is quite useful to us in this area since we see so many sled dogs in our practice, is now we've established a new set of normals for Alaskan Huskies. So if an Alaskan Husky comes into my practice, their values aren't necessarily the same as what's accepted for the Basset Hound. Interestingly, Greyhounds already have a set of values that are, the reference range is a little lower too. They just run a little lower. And so some of the dogs that are on Siloxane or thyroid supplements maybe don't need to be, or we're missing another condition because we're resting on this. So that's the practical application. The next area of research has actually been getting a lot of our attention, and for an unfortunate reason. We've been very fortunate on the Yukon Quest that we haven't lost any dogs in the last 4 years. On the Iditarod, they have an awful lot of dogs and an awful lot of drivers, and each year it seems that a dog or more does expire. And one of the reasons that we tend to see is gastric ulcers, and they can cause sudden death in two different ways. Either they cause vomiting, and a dog will aspirate, and so, asphyxiate. The other possibility is if they have a gastric ulcer that progresses, it can perforate and cause peritonitis or infection within the abdomen, and that can cause death as well, especially in a stressful situation like running a race. And so this is never good, and so this area of study has received probably the most attention in the last few years. The chief investigator is Dr. Michael Davis, who also is a diplomat and also a PhD, so he's way smarter than us. And he's a professor at Oklahoma State University at the veterinary school there. So he conducted this study at the 2001 and 2002 Iditarod. Involved 67 dogs from 9 teams, and he examined each stomach via endoscopy. And what that means is, I don't know if you've ever had your stomach scoped, you get to take a little snooze for this procedure, as do the dogs, and they use fiber optics and run a little tube down your esophagus and look in your stomach. And for ulcers, with people too, that's the way to diagnose them. All of these dogs were healthy finishers, so no one had been sick. Let's see, and I think I missed a slide. It's gone. Well, let me tell you then, part of the problem with gastric ulcers is that they can be really hard to diagnose on the trail. There is the clinical sign of vomiting blood that is a red flag, and we'll take that. However, dogs with stomach ulcers can actually be very subtle about it. They may have signs as subtle as missing a meal, maybe being a little sore in the abdomen, maybe some persistent diarrhea, maybe decrease in appetite, and all of those are things that we see for other reasons as well. Typically on the trail, as a trail veterinarian, if I see a dog that vomits and has a sore abdomen, we talk about dropping the dog because that's a distinct possibility. But these other subtle signs, not necessarily. So of the dogs that he examined endoscopically, 80% of them had clinically significant ulcers, or ulcers that, in practice I would treat if I saw them. And the other group the rest of them had abnormalities with the potential to become ulcers. So these ranged from, ulcers that you treat to a little blip on the stomach, but 80% of the dogs were affected. Interestingly, human marathon runners have a similar rate of gastrointestinal bleeding, which leads us to the deduction that diet is not likely the cause because people don't eat frozen meat and fat on races, just like they don't eat 18 Big Macs. So it's more likely the stress of strenuous exercise. Then, of course, that begs the question, what is stress? And that's a whole other line of research, because if that's the cause of this, the next logical step would be, well, how can we reduce it? Because we certainly don't want to see this much gastric ulceration. The subsequent studies were geared toward maybe reducing the problem or treating them rather than preventing, but you do what you can do. The first study focused on Prilosec, or omeprazole. And a group of dogs ran the Iditarod on Prilosec and then were scoped again later. And the omeprazole resulted in a decreased severity of lesions, but the prevalence was still the same. So 80% still had gastric lesions, they just weren't as severe. The other problem with omeprazole, it's not too bad, but a lot of the drivers that used it reported that their dogs had a little diarrhea, which, little's not bad, but for those of you who've run dogs long distances, yay, more diarrhea. So if you can avoid it, you do. A subsequent study by Karen Williams, also from Oklahoma State, and her group showed that famotidine or Pepcid did decrease the severity of ulcers and to a lesser degree their prevalence. It was also a little easier to administer. You didn't have to time it with food, that sort of thing. So for the time being, Pepcid seems to be the way to go. And then, of course, as a profession, we have to decide, well, who gets medicated when, that sort of thing. And so it opens some doors for us, but at least we have something that will help. The other interesting bit of research that Dr. Davis contributed actually started, this is what brought him to us, to our little sled dog community. He was doing some work with human asthma, or using a dog model, as we do for so many things. For those of you, 15% of you out there who have asthma, you've heard all this. But asthma results in airway inflammation, and it's typically reversible obstruction. The obstruction's with mucus, it's nothing awful, but an airway hyperreactivity, and it's not caused by infection. So by reversible, we mean with your bronchodilator. So you take your little puff, and it goes away. There are many triggers, and often there's an allergic component. And of course, up here, the smoke can be a huge trigger as well. We don't have smog, we have smoke. There are also secondary changes to the airways that can occur that can be almost impossible to reverse. It would be akin to scarring, and that's why if you're on asthma medication, your pulmonologist will say, don't take it, don't get off of it, you need to take it. And of course, 15% of us have it. Exercise-induced asthma is actually a little bit different, although there are a lot of people who have asthma who have symptoms that are triggered by exercise. So strictly speaking, exercise-induced asthma is asthma that is only triggered by exercise, and it seems to be more prevalent in elite athletes. And there's a subgroup of these folks who have what's called ski asthma, and that's athletes who are repeatedly breathing cold, dry air. And so this is the group that Dr. Davis looked at. Back in Oklahoma, he used the dog as a laboratory model to show that repeated cooling and drying of the lower airways can lead to a syndrome similar to asthma. And he did this by a bronchoscopy with the same little fiber optics. He was able to introduce cold, dry air to the lower airways and then look at the cellular debris that accumulated. So indeed, the dog is a good model for the human. And of course, who breathes more cold, dry air than sled dogs? And so in an effort to develop an actual exercising model rather than an anesthetized lab model, he came to us for sled dogs. And the studies using sled dogs were done also 2001, 2002 at the Iditarod. And he did bronchoscopy of a test group of finishers again, so dogs who did quite well. And he discovered that 81% of them had abnormal mucus and debris in the lower airways, which was consistent with what he found in the laboratory. Probably find the same thing in the mushers too. So he did 2 subsequent studies, and this is, I split the slide up because you're going to have to bear with me. I had to draw pictures to understand this. So he did 2 subsequent studies, and the first he conducted during the off-season. He wanted to see what happens to these dogs over time. So of that same group of finishers, he compared the lower airway debris in those finishers with the laboratory dogs back in Oklahoma during the summer. So everybody's breathing, well, warm air here. It's not all that moist, but warm air. Even after the race was over and they'd been home, they still had those changes present compared to control dogs back in Oklahoma. So of those dogs that finished the race and then still had those airway changes, he split them up into 2 groups the following fall when it's time to start training again. Half of them got to hang out in their kennel and not do anything, eat potato chips and sit on the sofa, and the other half had to train. And when he compared both of them through the season, he found that the differences in their airways just during training wasn't that great. The differences in the airways was completely from the competition, the endurance racing. So training wasn't enough to set them off or to, result in those changes, which is all very interesting, but so what? They finished. Well, to some degree, it is more of an academic exercise, and yes, so what? They did quite well, and there are compensatory mechanisms within the lungs to account for this, and that's why elite athletes who have ski asthma and exercise-induced asthma are still elite. When you exercise, there's sympathetic nervous system stimulation, and you have a little bronchodilation, so even if you have more crud down in your lungs, you've got bigger airways, and you can breathe by it. And also, the lung mass is pretty good size, so it's one of those organs that's very forgiving. However, there is a change in mucociliary clearance, and this is your other big word for the day. Mucociliary clearance is what happens when the little cilia in your lower airways combined with the mucus carries stuff back up out of your lungs, be it pollen, dust particles, viruses, bacteria. So if your mucociliary clearance is impaired, you could be susceptible to secondary infections. And though it's not been proven, I will tell you that in private practice, I very rarely see bacterial pneumonia in pet dogs. In Wisconsin, in 10 years, I think I treated 3. But we do see it on the trail now and then, so I think there is some degree of truth to that. Not necessarily anything we can change, but something that it's sure good to know and understand when we're planning our care for these guys. This picture is, I think it's Stewart River, but this is the ambulance. This is one of the Yukon Quest airplanes, and I think this is Kent, one of our pilots. And the dogs who are dropped, who are returned to their handlers, get to fly out, but the restraint mechanism is a mail bag. And so you just tuck the dog in the little mail bag and plop them on the plane, and they do quite nicely. Now, I don't think this is where Paris Hilton got the idea for the purse, but you never know. It is pretty styling. Makes them easy to handle. They're lovely dogs. So in closing, we need to acknowledge a number of people, and of course these are lead investigators who've contributed to this body of knowledge. They have people who collaborated with them, and of course we don't have listed, who also we need to thank. Also, we need to thank especially Stuart Nelson. He is the head veterinarian for the Iditarod, and credit where credit is due. Since he's been head veterinarian in 1996, he has facilitated several research studies that have benefited us all. And so his tireless effort and his ability to network and to encourage mushers to work with researchers has really helped us out. And now for a lot of these projects, they're ongoing. There are projects looking at stress and the immune system, some very interesting things going on there. And those are off-season projects that have all stemmed out of this relationship. And so we're very thankful for that. And also the sled dog photos, I need to thank the Yukon Quest for allowing me to lift a bunch of them, and Karsten Thies, their very able photographer. Vern Starks, my good friend, who shares pictures with me and then I use them. And also Skunks Place Kennel. Some of these dogs are Allie Zirkles. So in closing, I hope this was interesting. I hope now that, if you go down to the finish of the quest or you watch the start, you can have a greater appreciation for what these dogs can and do. And, as you follow the website and enjoy the race, think in the back of your head, 18 Big Macs, wow. I wonder if those freeze well. So I guess that's it for me. Are there any questions? Amy, how did you want to handle that? Oh, before I forget, the Yukon Quest website, do follow it. The race starts Saturday, February 10th in Whitehorse, and they'll be moving this way. And so I encourage you to watch and come down to the finish and enjoy the dogs.
Yeah, I had a question in reference to a term that you used. It was called double coating of sled dogs. Could you clarify that?
Oh, double coating. Yeah, double coat is, when you see the big northern breeds, if you comb through their hair, they've got the fuzzy stuff next to the skin, and then they have the longer guard hairs. Does that make sense? Double coating, yeah. So they've got a double coat. They've got the long guard hairs that are shiny, and then the fuzzy stuff that when they shed, that's the stuff that comes out. So for both those races, they need to have a double hair coat, whereas like a straight greyhound doesn't.
Any other questions out there?
Amy, there's one up front. Oh, go ahead.
With the dogs that suffer from low sodium, what do you recommend for replenishing that?
Unfortunately, by the time we know that they are suffering from low sodium, it's because we saw the blood work afterward. Typically on the race, we won't know that. But like anything, if they'll eat, they'll get their sodium. So usually the low sodium is more of a result of another problem than something that specifically needs to be addressed by itself. If they got diarrhea or they're vomiting, they can lose sodium that way too. But usually if they're maintaining hydration and they're eating, their sodium will be okay. But we won't actually know specifically low sodium unless we do blood work, which typically we don't until after the fact.
How often do you change the dog booties, and how long do the booties last?
It depends on the kind of booty. We used to, used to use the old polar fleece booties, and those usually lasted about 20 miles. The newer Cordura, I've heard 40, 50 miles on a good day. It depends on the terrain, though. If you're trucking up a road, then they're not going to last as long. If you go through overflow, you got to pack them up. You got to take them off or they'll freeze. So it depends if you're going through nice, soft snow, granular snow. But 40 to 50 is optimal.
Anyone else? All right.
Oh, you guys are easy.
Thanks.